First of all, I do have to apologise because my son is at home rather unwell, so I might have to leave before the panel finishes, and if I do, it's not because of any late at all, but simply because of much body out. So, with those words in mind, I'll begin. What I thought I'd do, because obviously I don't have anything near the experience of what's happening in Afghanistan as anyone else, as the other members of the panel do. So I thought I'd just provide a little bit of context to the discussions that might follow. Thinking first a little bit about the historical context behind what is going on in the country today. Secondly, thinking a little bit about some of the scenarios and the possibilities that have emerged in the context of the return to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan after August 2021. And then finally, just a few thoughts on the future and potential ways forward and things that might be emphasised in terms of the ways in which people approach the country. So firstly, in terms of the sort of its historical context, that I think is often missed out of sort of popular or public debates and representations of Afghanistan, is the, we often see representations of Afghanistan in the media as this remote and isolated country that's sort of unique and exceptional and set off from the rest of the world. Whereas, as we all know, in fact, those are entirely inaccurate representations of the territories that currently form Afghanistan. Afghanistan and its territories is historically connected to multiple regions, South and Central and West Asia, and also beyond. And it's also connected, and it was connected through mobile people, and people who travel for trade, who travel for work, who travel for labour, for education, for intellectual pursuits. And so Afghanistan is very much a dynamic space, or historically has been a dynamic and connected space, as the term goes, at the sort of heart of Asia. But unfortunately, that history has so often been overlooked. When we think about other terms popular in the West, when you used to think about Afghanistan, that horrible one, the graveyard of empires, which somehow depicts Afghanistan as nothing other than a place of death. The sort of vitality and the connectedness of Afghanistan has, of course, been sidelined as a result of over 2 centuries of colonial and imperial violence, of both overt and covert violence, that's been inflicted upon the innocent people of Afghanistan, and that has wrought chaos in their communities, their families, and the places in which they live. And of course, that history of violence goes back to at least to the early 19th century with the British Empire and its disputes and conflicts and the use of Afghanistan's territories as part of broader imperial competition. And then it extended into the Cold War era, where, of course, we all know the country became a contested zone and space between the USSR and the USA and all of their various allies. And then after 2001, of course, this sort of history of violence took on new forms in the context of the so-called global war on terror. And this history has had really profound effects on the people living in Afghanistan and the communities that they form. Communities have been cut off progressively from the wider cultural and economic and political worlds that historically they inhabited. And one can think about that as a process that's affected peoples across Afghanistan. You only need to think of northern Afghanistan and its historic connections to the great centres of learning of both religion and philosophy and culture in places such as Bukhara and Samarkand. But it's also, of course, affected the connections to South Asia, India in particular, which was, of course, a very important historic source of revenue for Afghanistan, and a place to which people moved to work, trade, to conduct economic life, and so on and so forth. Another profound effect of this history of violence has had on the country is the degree to which the sort of knowledge that has been generated in the context of colonial and imperial expansion about Afghanistan has then itself come to be an important part of the thinking and the worldviews of people in Afghanistan, in particular the political elites, who in their interactions with the wider world have often used the sort of categories given to them or that have been politically motivated and used by imperial formations. And that type of knowledge, often referred to in the academy as colonial knowledge, has also had profoundly negative effects, not only on the world, on how the world understands Afghanistan, but also on the nature of the dynamics within Afghanistan. And we can think of a whole range of concepts that have had very negative consequences for the political dynamics and the wider dynamics and experiences of people in the country, ranging from ethnicity, which of course is such a simplistic way of talking about very complicated forms of cultural diversity, or what some of the people in this room refer to as Afghanistan's mosaic society, but also to ideas like the sort of this binary contrast between majority on the one hand and minority on the other, which are of course political constructs connected to Western political theory that don't do justice to the complexity of Afghanistan's social and cultural makeup itself. But we can also think about the ways in which Islam and religion have come to be treated. And of course, particularly the global war on terror and its focus on radicalism and so on and so forth, almost entirely overlooked a very different history in Afghanistan of interreligious interaction and coexistence. And that's something I've been exploring with great interest recently through work that I've been doing with Sikh and Hindus and also Jewish people from Afghanistan. So these are just some of the effects of that history on the country. And as I've said, what happened in Afghanistan after 2001 really accelerated these trends. The cutting off of Afghanistan from the world became, the reduction of the ability of people in Afghanistan to move and to be mobile became even more starkly highlighted in that period, when you had hundreds of thousands almost of foreign troops and aid professionals and humanitarian workers travelling back and forth to Afghanistan, whilst at the same time the people of Afghanistan themselves were increasingly denied the ability to move and work elsewhere as part of new border regimes, and we can see those unfolding still today. There was also a complete sort of domineering over-reliance on the idea that Afghanistan's political structures should be founded on a sort of negotiation between different so-called ethnic groups and their political power brokers, which overlooked the far more complex and intricate dynamics that go on within the country. And then finally, a sort of a further aspect of that intervention was the very far-reaching environmental consequences that it's had. Of course, Afghanistan, like the rest of the world, has been very badly affected, as we all know, by broader issues, climate change, which are caused by the emissions of largely the sort of historically industrialized countries. But in the context of the international intervention, there was also massive new forms of environmental destruction. We think of the use of new military equipment, the mother of all bombs, for example, as President Trump referred to it, or the burn pits that became located across the country. And so that last 20 years then really compounded and added to the very troubled history that Afghanistan had in the previous 150 years. So what about what's been happening then since the return to power of the Taliban, and how should we think about that? I'm not an expert on this, and I haven't been to Afghanistan since the Taliban returned, so I'm not going to talk in any specific details, and my co-panelists are much better versed to address this issue than I am. But I just sort of think about some scenarios that were raised in the context of 2021, and then think about the actual reality that's unfolded since then. So, when the Taliban returned, obviously there was a great deal of shock and horror and critique, but there were also voices who argued that the departure of the international forces and the international presence will perhaps make two things possible that wouldn't have been feasible if they'd remained in the country for any longer. One of those possibilities was that after this long period of conflict, both in the 1980s and the 1990s, and then in the first decades of the 2000s, there would be a need for people from Afghanistan to themselves interact with one another and address the issues that they had collectively faced and the trauma that they had collectively faced over those past 40 years of war. And those type of conversations and rearrangements and negotiations wouldn't have been, are not possible when you have tens of thousands of troops stationed in your country and military bases. As we all know, one of the things that really used to irritate me during the 2001 to 2021 period was the term capacity building. That the international ISAF forces and the humanitarian organisations were there to build the capacity of people in Afghanistan. When anyone who's spent any time in Afghanistan, or amongst indeed people here and outside of the country, know that this is a country full of people with vast, deep reservoirs of human capacity. And one of the areas of that capacity is the ability to interact across boundaries, to come to negotiation, to come to points of compromise, and to interact with one another. So the presence of the sort of foreign forces made those type of interactions very difficult. And there was this hope that the withdrawal of forces would make those type of conversations more feasible and possible. And the second sort of scenario that was also thought about was that the removal of this very external presence in the country would also make feasible the development of regional solutions. So without the American bases in Bagram and wherever else, there would be the possibility for all these very different and complicated countries in the region to work together to come up with a regional solution for what, after all, is ultimately a regional issue. It's sort of the people of Afghanistan. But, and this is from an outsider's perspective, and as I say, I haven't been to Afghanistan since the Taliban returned, but from an outsider's perspective, then what is the reality? Or what are the dynamics on the ground that we can see unfolding over the past 4 years or so? One, of course, is that whilst the forces and the embassies might have closed, Afghanistan continues, and indeed its neighbours, to be very closely linked and connected to the power holders in Europe and America. And so, whilst there isn't a sort of physical presence necessarily on the ground, that influence is still there. And much of that influence continues to operate using the same categories and simplistic understandings of Afghanistan that have been important in previous eras. Secondly, what about the so-called regional dynamics? Well, unfortunately, that too has overall been, and from my perspective at least, been really quite negative and disappointing. And one only needs to think about the vast numbers of people from Afghanistan that are being returned from Pakistan, from Iran, putting more pressures on the population in Afghanistan, destroying more livelihoods, as really being evidence for the lack of that regional attempt to deal in a historically informed way with the issues that Afghanistan faces. So rather than there having been the sort of development, expansion and thickening of regional connections, what's actually happened is their further erosion, which has put livelihoods and the well-being of people in Afghanistan, I would say, further in peril. Afghanistan also continues to find itself as a sort of betwixt and between the various tensions in the region. We can think about the recent India-Pakistan conflict and the ways in which that may or may not have affected China's decision to sort of incorporate Afghanistan within the sort of CPAC program. So Afghanistan, and then also the recent events in Iran demonstrating similar things about how, rather than a sort of regional consensus, there continues to be the basically the strategic use of Afghanistan and its problems by regional powers. Now, that's not my field at all, but that certainly seems to be the case from the perspective of a sort of external observer. Also, let's think about the sort of the need for dialogue and discussion. Well, in today's world, that's very hard indeed without an open, or at least a sort of relatively open and functioning media environment. And I think many of us are aware here that there have been growing pressures and real serious pressures on the media and their activities in Afghanistan. They're also, of course, restricting the ability of people to discuss and debate and address issues affected by ongoing violence against the sort of perceived opponents of the Taliban, which also makes that type of discussion, which is really so important, I think, to the country's future, very difficult. And then finally, as I'm sure Fazia Kufi is going to talk about, there is those ongoing restrictions on the education, working lives, and health, really, of 50% of the population, that's to say, women in Afghanistan. And so when we hear about there having been a sort of security dividends, to use the sort of jargon for Afghanistan of the return to power of the Taliban, but what type of security are people talking about? And again, that's a very narrow understanding of security. That if we were to think about broader human security and well-being, then unfortunately the situation just continues to go from bad to worse. So what about things that can be emphasised in the future? Now, I know that there's a great deal of debate about different paths and the ways in which Afghanistan should go in the future, but I suppose from my perspective as an anthropologist, there are sort of less hard or rather policy things that I think should be given greater recognition. One, and this is the importance of this event today and many others that this and other organisations assemble, and that Luke already sort of hinted at, which is the need for open debate about the ongoing impact of these histories of colonialism and intervention and occupation on Afghanistan and its peoples, and the need for that debate and that knowledge and understanding to be circulated, not of course only outside of the country, but more importantly within it, so that people themselves can understand the sort of how some of the prisms through which Afghanistan is regarded are so faulty and inaccurate. And the second thing and connected to that is also the real importance for for sort of indigenous and local forms of knowledge and understanding to be given much greater value in discussions about Afghanistan, be those related to Islam, or be those related to Afghanistan's cultural history and its historic geographical location and the great wealth of cultural knowledge of importance to people in the country, dealing with issues ranging from, the economy to politics, to ethics, to culture. Those things need to be given a greater import. And finally, two more points would be, one, that there's a real need to bring to the policy discussions new voices and new ideas. The sort of approaches of people in the country whose voices are often ignored, people who are aware of Afghanistan's connections, who are connected to different societies, who live across boundaries. My own work with traders from Afghanistan, for example, who I continue to be amazed by in terms of the great realm of connections or range of connections that they have both in that region and beyond, and their ability to live across multiple cultures and societies, multiple knowledges of languages, and also their ability to negotiate between people of different political persuasions and so-called ethnic groups in Afghanistan. We need to, those people's skills need to be better recognised, because all too often in Afghanistan, as indeed in many other nation states, there's a tendency for things to be centralised at the level of the state, rather than to actually embrace the skills and capacities of the people themselves. And finally, I think also that as the political discussions go on, the enormous importance of the environmental catastrophe that's affecting Afghanistan in multiple respects, from climate change to the ongoing legacy of the wars that have affected the country, also need to be addressed collectively by people there, so that Afghanistan can be what we all know it is, which is this remarkably beautiful and substantial and significant region within Asia more generally. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I hope that that's just provided at least some context behind what will be, I'm sure, 3 very fascinating discussion points to come. And I really do apologise, I will have to leave shortly, but I'd love to stay to listen to your talks. Thank you.